Hello and welcome back, and that's right, today we're going to do another video in the series where we talk about DIY NAS, do-it-yourself NAS, ultimately building it yourself and saving yourself a bit of old bunts compared with going with a turnkey solution up there. Now, very recently, for me, about 3 days ago, my video regarding this, the Jonsbo N2 build went live. It was a 100k subscription celebration video where we built this thing from scratch using a TopTon board. And although we had lots of positive comments on there, thank you very much for those, a lot of you did also highlight your own builds, the builds that you went for, the builds you'd recommend, the parts that you would have changed. So that's where today's video is born from. This video where we are going to go through what I think is a fantastic build for under 250 nicker, another build for under 500 nicker, and a final build for under 1000 nicker. What's a nicker? What's in the build? What's included? What isn't? All of these disclaimers need to be explained. So let's run the introduction there and make our way over to the screen where we're going to start going through these builds together. So once again, as mentioned, this video has come about thanks to this one here. It's the one that we went and did a whole Jonsbo N2 build for 260 nicker, and we also did a video on it, which was here, and we got so many comments on there, and a lot of you users not only saying nice things about the channel, thanks for that, but on top of that, going through your builds, what you change and more. Now, it's also worth highlighting, as mentioned, that we are going to be building the N3, and I just wanted to do a particular shout out to these users here. Semaphore, spelt strange, Christopher Stackman 6469, Stevuso B411, and Pete Breen, because thanks to you and your donations, we went ahead and bought the N3. We're in the process of finalising the MoBo, the CPU, and more when we do that build video, but we have already ordered it, and it, predominantly would have waited a little bit longer to see how the video fared, but thanks to you guys we went ahead and ordered that device immediately. We're still going through the process of getting the other parts for that, but that means this channel is going to have that N3 build very soon, or at least very soon. This is Aliexpress, good god. But thanks to you guys, we got that put together much quicker, so I wanted to thank you guys directly on that one. But what's included in today's video? Well, it's worth highlighting before we go through the 3 builds, and they should be chapterized at the bottom. We're not including software in the pricing here, so whether it is you're going to go TrueNAS, whether it is you're going to go OMV, Open Media Vault, or you're going to be going Unraid, you're not going to be able to, you're going to have to make that choice yourself. And although the first 2 are free, it's worth highlighting that the third one is license-led, so that will affect the price point you need to go for there. Also, if you go for Unraid, you're going to need a USB stick there, as well as TrueNAS, for example, needing an OS drive. More on that later on. Next, when I say 250, 500 and 1000 nicker, what does that even mean? I'm from East London, unfortunately, it's never really left me. But whether it is you're in the UK with pounds, you're in the greater part of Europe, which have got euros, or you're in the US with US dollar, the conversion rates aren't actually that different. If anything, the pound's not looking too great these days. But when all of the parts that we're looking at today, they're going to be vaguely similar pricing wherever you are in the world in your local currency. You're just going to need to factor in 1, delivery cost, which unfortunately I have not included in today's video, and 2, you're going to have to factor in tax. Some of the sellers we're going to talk about today do include the tax, some don't, and you may have to deal with import tax on some items, and in some cases, some of the backwater AliExpress ones, chuck it out the door with a lovely modified invoice and you will never have to pay tax on that. That's down to you, your conscience, and your god of choice, but that's why we've not included a specific currency or tax and delivery in today's video there. And finally, I've not included multimedia. I've not included the hard drives that you're going to be going for there. I'm not including the SSDs. I hate seagulls. They're kicking off today. But just for the purpose of this video, it's worth highlighting I've got 2 recommendations there, at least at the time of recording, for storage media. So although these are not included in the 250, 500 or 1000 nicker, which by the way, that last one is actually more like 750, I'm going to make some recommendations there. Straight away, the Seagate iWolf drives, they are regularly on offer. And particularly if you're looking at the 4TB drives, at any time of day, you are more likely to find the 4TB drive on offer. Seriously, seagulls. So for example, right now on Amazon UK here, you can pick them up for 81 nicker. But if you head over to B&H, you can pick them up for 84, and if you head over to Newegg, you can get 10 TB drives from WD Red for 189. That means, going to my breakdown there on the other side of the screen, that for about 405 quid, you can get 20 TB of storage or 16 TB in a RAID 5, or if you go for those 10 TB drives, it will add an additional $949 for 50 terabytes of storage or 40 terabytes in a RAID 5 environment. I'm trying to talk over that guy. The result is that you are going to have to add the cost of those to the overall heading there in terms of price point. I'm just going to talk through them, and ultimately, although it's not included in the 250, 500 or 1000, I will say that either one of those is going to be a factor, and you can still generate storage over time. You can add gradual drives in most RAID configurations. Even TrueNAS is starting to embrace RAID expansions, although it's not fully there yet. Okay, so on to our first selection here. This is our under 250 Nicker option, and I'll put it out there straight away. A couple of the choices in this build you're probably going to want to change, and unfortunately will increase the price by about 20 Nicker overall. But to remain under 250, here is how I went about it. So first and foremost, you're going to need the case, right? I've gone for the black case, just like the one that we used here on the table. Bear in mind, right the way throughout the course of this, one of the big barriers you're going to find about getting components that go inside the Jonsbo here is not only have you got to use those mini ITX boards inside, but the height you've got in there is pretty limiting, and certain components are not really going to be able to exceed about 6.5 centimeters. In particular, CPU fans, and that will become very important later on. But also, if you plan on taking advantage of the PCIe slot to add enhanced network adapter ports there, or M.2 cards inside, you are going to have to, factor that in when going for this case. It's still a great case with everything all, portioned out quite well, but it is worth bearing that in mind. So, alongside this, of course, I've gone for a TopTon here. We're looking at the N6005 or the N5105 one there. Now, you can go for the Pentium. It will increase the price a fraction. More on that later on. But for this build, you can either get the card on its own or add those add-ons there for memory. Now, in the build we did for the previous video, we were looking at utilising that N5105 CPU because it was inside most of the domestic and, featured class of the likes of Synology, QNAP and more. But what I will say is some of you, when you're searching online, you might spot boards with this CPU, the J6412 CPU inside it, which is a Celeron and is technically newer. But I will state that the J6125 and J6413 CPU is actually lesser powered than that of the N5105. So you may see offers floating around on it, but just bear in mind that you actually lose out in some cases. And some of these motherboards, when you dig in, this isn't one of those examples because it's got a couple of M2 slots, which can be beneficial, as we saw in that CWWK 6-bay that we did around about 2 months ago. But some of the other boards that have got that CPU inside don't have enough SATA connectors, and you're going to have to end up utilising the PCIe slot, if indeed it's available, to add a SATA card there or a SATA bridging card, but more on that later on. Don't worry, we do go through the list of components at the end. So if carrying on from there, you're going to need that SATA multi-lane there to attach the SATA backplane there onto the main motherboard. Again, I've searched around. This is pretty much as good as the price as it goes there, to be perfectly honest. Now, when it comes to the PSU, this is one of those areas where you might want to throw a bit more money at the problem, but it's really going to come down to you and what you want. So, for example, this is a 400 watt PSU here, and this is the 400 watt that we were supposed to use for our build previously, but it ended up not working very well, and we ended up swapping it out for another one. Now, this is same scale but different brand, and you are getting an Aliexpress PSU, so it's a nightmare to send back, but nevertheless, this is probably the cheapest SFX PSU that I could find on the market that had a decent enough rating there. Moving forward, we can look at the overall spend thus far. It's 264. Hold back, I know what you're going to say. So that 264 quid there has got the multi-lane, it's got the PSU, it's got the case, and it's got the CPU and 4 gig of memory and a 128 gig NVMe included inside. So that's pretty much a good standard build there, but of course it is not under 250 Nika there, of course. Now, there are ways to make that saving within this build, but bear in mind, by making these small changes, you will be missing out on some elements. So, for example, if you want to go super budget, you can go ahead and go for this lesser PSU here. This is a 250 watt PSU here, and it's also very ARM branded. I'm not a huge fan of this one. It's pretty bare bones. The other thing is it only has one Molex connector, so you will need to go for that adapter there to add a double Molex via SATA changeover there. But bear in mind, you might also need that available SATA on the board for adding more ports, like adding more storage later on. The other thing I will add is the only way to get to that 247 price was to remove the NVMe inside. So although it was still the build, it meant if you were going to go for an unraid build, you probably wouldn't even need the M.2 NVMe. But if you were going to go for a true NAS build, you're going to need that OS storage drive. But ultimately, if you are prepared to cut a few corners on this build, you can get hold of this for sub 250 Nika. Again, I would still argue, chuck a couple of tenors at the problem, you know, 20, maybe 25 quid, and upgrade that PSU a little bit there, or go for the integrated one there that's got the NVMe, because you will make savings for going for one of these OEM chucked in SSDs for your OS, but that really is up to you. But I think we should move on things just a little bit more aggressive here on our N2 builds. And now onto our sub 500 Nika build there. Now this is one where we want to scale up a lot of the components, but this is when things like cooling are going to really take place, because as good as the N2 casing is, this is a very compact chassis. And although it separates a lot of the components quite well with plenty of passive ventilation, this is where active cooling is going to be paramount and maximizing that space. So for this build, we add in the N2 just like we did before. Moreover, we add in that same SATA because we're not changing the case up to the N3. This is still a 5+1 SATA case, so we need a 6 port adapter there. Next, we look at the PSU. We're going for there that 400 watt PSU, so we're going straight in. But when it comes to the MoBo, there's actually integrated MITX boards available on Aliexpress that are surprisingly more advanced than you might like. Now, this one is an Intel 12th Gen i5 CPU, so it's 12th gen, so it's not the very bleeding edge there, but it is still an i5 of the 12th gen there. The other thing I will add is that F there, which is really important, because this may put some users off. If a motherboard has F on it, not motherboard, if a CPU has F on it, that means a lack of integrated graphics there. Digging into that CPU a bit, we can see that it was released in 2022, in the first quarter of 2022, but again, as mentioned, there is a complete lack of integrated graphics. It's a Gen 4 CPU there, which means we're going to go for a Gen 4 motherboard, which means we can take advantage of certain upgrades later on, but this is going to be a file server type system here, and if you're going to be utilizing it for multimedia, you may find it ever so slightly lacking there due to its lack of that transcoding. There is an upgradable slot there. It's 4x16, I believe potentially even 5x16 in the next build, so a graphics card is not off the table. But remember, this is a half height case, and therefore you are going to have limited spacing there overall. So just factor in, if you are looking at multimedia playback, this might not be the CPU for you, but there are ways and means to make allowances. Now, on this, for 235 Nika, not only have we got the motherboard and the CPU, but we've also got 16 gig of DDR4 memory included as well on this board. What do we like, what do we dislike about this board? Well, as much as I like the fact it's got that CPU, doesn't have a CPU fan. More on that in a moment. Another thing worth bearing in mind is it's only got 4 SATA ports by default, so we will have to address that and rebalance that later on. But apart from that, we do have that upgrade slot that we can take advantage of. And another thing that's worth touching on is it only has the single LAN. More on that later on. But that's the MoBo that we've seen there. It's a decent little motherboard with a nice heightened memory support of up to 64 gig. Wi-Fi 6 integrated into it. And there's still lots of standard options there that in a pre-attached, ready-to-go board for 235, it's saving you a lot of hassle. Moving forward onto that fan, when it comes to the CPU fan, we've got to factor in that height of about 6.5 centimeters there to play with. So you've got to look at low profile heights there for the CPU. We're talking 65mm and lower. And although there are some pretty decent ones in the market that are compatible with this MoBo, when you're starting to see side load fan CPUs, they're going to be like 100 to 120 millimeters high. They're just simply not going to fit in that cavity there in the top. So you've got to scale things down a little bit. So this is the CPU fan we're looking at here. Again, you can get it integrated with the LEDs if you want, but you don't really need to. Moving forward from that, addressing that balance we mentioned earlier on when it comes to the network ports, and this board only having just the one, this does open the door to taking advantage of 10 gigabit Ethernet. That's right, we've got a 10G card here, and it's the X540T2 card there, so this allows us to integrate it at 39 NICA, and that's a couple of ports being added there. Auto negotiation is not on the table, unfortunately. It's 1 or 10. But I think most users won't mind, and that'll allow us to have a couple of 10G ports on our sub 500 NICA build. So where does that put us price wise? Well, as you can see here, it puts us at 390 quid, which is pretty damn good. That still leaves us about 100 NICA to play with there, where we can scale up the memory if we choose to. We can add those M.2 NVMe or one or more on there. But one of the other things we're going to need to talk about there is SATA bridging boards. That is right. Remember earlier on I mentioned on this board it's got 4 SATAs. Remember, this is a 5/6 SATA case there. In order to get around that, you could look at things like this, which are kind of SATA motherboard expansion cards. Now, you're not going to want to run all of the SATAs from this because it is going to be sharing the bandwidth. But in order to add 1 or 2 more bays, this may be a way to kind of separate at least a couple of drives into a single SATA lane there to take advantage of. Now, bear in mind, while you're doing this, there's going to be a lot of boards on the market, and this one may seem a little pricey as kind of in a bridge that you can mount inside the case, but this is one that has SATA power. It also has individual USB power provided via a separate cable if you choose, but the reason I go for this one is simply that it has the option of SATA power, therefore keeping everything in case. But just bear in mind that by using this, you will be sharing some of the bandwidth on those SATA bays. Now, given a lot of hard drives right now, you might see are going to be knocking around 150 to 200 megs. You've got 6 gigabits to play with on a SATA lane, so it's not the end of the world by using a card like that. But even if you add that card on for 20 quid, this build is still way under that 500 NICA remit that we talked about there, and you can still start factoring in an OS NVMe. Now, I mentioned earlier on, but I will highlight again, as good as the CPU is in terms of power, in terms of modern usage and supporting some of the newer generation of PCIe, it doesn't have integrated graphics there. There are alternatives out there, but the integrated graphics CPUs, as you will see from the final part of this video, will tend to add a decent 15 to maybe even 18% price on most Intel Core CPUs. Now, we could have gone Ryzen. The reason there's not any direct Ryzen comparisons in this video is I've only really, in this case, looked at or helped people with Intel builds. And when it comes to changing a lot of my existing knowledge into using the AMD profiles there, some of it might have got wrong. So at the risk of giving you guys information that may be incorrect inadvertently or advertently, I'd rather stick to the Intels for this. But let's move on to our final section, the sub 1000 builds. Now, it says under 1,000. Now, I'm going to make it clear, it's actually significantly beneath that. I've got it down to about 800 or so quid. To give you a quick preview before we go through it all, I got it down to 123 NICA being spent here on Aliexpress and 701 NICA being spent there on Amazon. So that brings us to about 823, 824 quid. That gives you a lot of leeway. But I will say, as we go through this, you'll see that some of these components, they're actually either or. There is a lot of flexibility to this build, and that extra bit of saving that you're making there could really go to some quality of life upgrades on your own personal setup. So straight away, we've got the Jonsbo N2, we've got the same SATA multi-lane there. Again, we will be redoing all of this when we go for the Jonsbo N3, and of course, we've got that CPU there. I've scaled up to a 400 to 600 watt PSU and gone for a 600 watt PSU for reasons that will become clear throughout the course of this. First up, the motherboard. I've gone for the Asus ROG Z690M. The reason being it's got Gen 4 M.2 NVMe's, but it's also got Gen 5 PCIe connectivity on that single lane, which on a micro ATX board is really, really impressive, I've got to say. Now, again, this is another board that's got 4 SATA, so you will see that bridging board coming into play again later on, but you don't necessarily have to go with that because you're going to have choices later on what to make with that PCIe slot there. So the motherboard, the motherboard combination we're talking about here actually has quite a lot of lanes to play with there, and the generation of those from the 5x16 slot and the M2 kind of cooling riser card are all available to be used on the system. It's 2.5G by default, and it's Wi-Fi 6E by default with the antennas included. So, and with 2 LAN ports by default and the Wi-Fi 6 allowed and included by default, there's a huge amount of day one bandwidth to play with. Clearly not enough, but it's nice to have that early doors. Now that gives us that we're going to have to lock ourselves in to a 1700 CPU there, an LGA. So for the CPU, if we go into the Intel, we've gone for the i5 12600K. Now remember, there we've got no F there. That means integrated graphics. That's right, we got ourselves some integrated graphics there. Decent little base frequency for those. Also, this is a CPU with 10 cores separated over 6/4, and you know, pretty well priced. I'll be straight with you. I found it on offer in a few locations, but even on offer, this is a quite down their price at 239 quid. Again, there are other CPUs out there you could choose, but a lot of the more affordable CPUs that you will find, these are the ones that don't have integrated graphics. Now, I think at this build, you might want to have a bit of either or. Now, if you spend that money I mentioned at the intro, that 150 NICA that you can have lying around, you could really beef this up to an i7, i9, maybe scale up to one of the 14 or 16 core CPUs. But I've gone for this one because it's nicely priced versus effectively what you're getting for your money overall. Now, again, we've got that bridging board we mentioned earlier on. You might want to go down a PCIe card route, but just remember, you've only got one lane to play with. When you move over to the N3 Jonsbo case, you've got a couple of lanes you can use on a larger TX board, but unfortunately that is not available on that N2 there. If we move forward, CPU fans, if you want to save a bit of money, which at this scale I wouldn't recommend, you can go for a very mini 2000 RPM, that one there. It will sort of do the job, but it will be noisy even if it says low noise, and it will just about fit in this case. I wouldn't recommend this. I'm including it as an affordable option when really I would go for, say, the Noctua, which I know costs a lot more money, but this CPU is going to get warm, and again, it's all being stored in that tiny little top cavity there, so cooling is going to be incredibly important, and you're going to have to get the most space efficiency as possible with that sub 6.5mm spacing. So this is the best option I could find out there, and unfortunately not on offer, so that's the one we went for. On top of that, memory, I've gone for a nice easy 32 gig on this build. You've only got 2 DIMM slots there, so you're not really going to be able to look on those multi ones, but still it's a nice little setup there for 60 NICA. And moving forward, you're going to have to look at what you can do with that available slot, because that's a, you know, going to be very important, because although we've got a couple of 2.5Gs there, perhaps you want to start adding some of those 10 gigs that we mentioned earlier on. Alternatively, remember, this is a Gen 4 M2 and Gen 5 PCIe slot system. You can go for some of these hypercards, where some of these cards have got multiple Gen 4 M2 NVMe slots in that, you know, available area there for you to really enjoy. Unfortunately, a lot of these cards are not low profile, so you're going to have to shop around and find some of those low profile cards. Remember, you can find the dimensions there, and as you can see if we go through it, this isn't going to fit, but there are dual port cards out there you can use, or if you're going to go for a 10G upgrade, make sure you look at some of the 10G cards that have got those low profile brackets to switch out between. Personally, I'd say 10G on this system, but if you want to take advantage of NVMe's, do bear in mind there is of course that NVMe slot on the system itself, just underneath that M2 armor. So you're going to have at least access to a fast acting drive there, you know, so you're not limited in any real regard. And when we go through the available storage slots on this, as we go into storage, you can see that it's got dual M2 slots there for you to be playing along with. So you're not limited in that regard. So that brings our total there in terms of getting the case, the cable, and that PSU to £123.51. And when we're looking at getting the rest of the components, again, you'll have to choose between going for a hypercard. This card isn't compatible, but most of the cards I have seen retail for about 90 to 120. So it'll either be that card or that card there in terms of spending on 10G upgrades. Now, I will add, if we go for it there is cards like this from QNAP, and some of these are Gen 4 as well, where these are combination M.2 NVMe and 10G cards, and these are PC compatible, and I'm pretty sure there are Linux drivers out there. I can't confirm whether users have found these cards to be working within an Unraid or TrueNAS environment. I'm sure someone on GitHub has had a lot of fun changing it, but if you go to the low profile adapter, this will fit in this case. So this gives you the option to have 10GBE and M.2 NVMe's. Don't go for the older generation cards. They're locked in at Gen 2, but some of the newer generation cards are at Gen 3 and even Gen 4 in some cases. And they'll allow you to have a combination of 10GBE 1 and 2 ports and M.2 NVMe slots. But make sure you go for the one with the active cooling there, not just the heatsink. But ultimately, regardless of those options that you go for, you're still going to be looking, if you go for baseline components, you're still only looking at about 800 Nika that you've spent, giving you 200 Nika there to scale up M.2 NVMe for storage, giving you the option to scale up some of that active cooling there, some of the M.2 NVMe stuff, changing some of the network adapter ports there, or just scaling up individual components. Ultimately, when I said that this was under 1000 Nika, I wasn't kidding. And just bear in mind while we're talking about all of this, that none of this factors in your storage, whether it's your M.2 NVMe's, your caching drives, or your overall storage. And that's the beauty of a case like this, because for its compact nature, there is a whole lot of storage in there while still maintaining a decent scale of cooling, active and passive respectively. But just keep in mind that whether you are looking at that 250 build, whether you're looking at the 500 build, or if you're looking at the 1000 build, that all three of these are hugely adaptable, and therefore you can scale up and down on a lot of these things that better suit your storage needs. Now, all of the components I've talked about today in their individual groups will either be in the description if there's enough space, thank you YouTube, or linked in the article over on NAS Compares, and it will go through all of those. Finally, we will be reviewing and building on the N3. Once again, I'd like to do a special thank you to those that donated to the previous video that has allowed us to go ahead and not only get that device, but also get the components for this build to come to us very soon. So I look forward to that build video. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you've got any further questions or things you'd like to see on the channel, let me know in the comments. If you need help with your own personal build, there's the free advice section over on NAS Compares, alongside the forum, the Discord, and of course, we've got our inner circle there. Head over to Ko-Fi or Patreon to learn more. But apart from that, all that wanky speak aside, have yourselves a fantastic week.